Hello and welcome to National Park Wild. I'm Eric. Today, once again, talking about my favorite national park, Yellowstone. Yellowstone National Park is one of the most well-known around the world, renowned for its unique geothermal features, breathtaking landscapes, and of course, its wildlife. And perhaps the most notable animal in the park is the American bison. It's the national mammal of the United States, and there are thousands of American bison around the park. You're very likely to see a herd of them at least once while you're there. And getting a great photo of them is an unforgettable experience. Another unforgettable thing is headlines about bison incidents. You've probably seen some of these before, whether people got too close and were injured, or they intentionally tried to harass bison. There have been 34 bison incidents in the 21st century. There were plenty beforehand as well, but in this video, I want to discuss every incident of this century. I got the information from the NPS incident report. The date of the actual report will be shown at the top, and the text from the actual report will be shown every time. It's not perfect, there are some typos here and there, but I highlighted most of the important stuff, and I will summarize that for each of the 34 incidents. Afterwards, I will provide some interesting statistics and give you advice for your trip to Yellowstone in regards to bison. With all of that out of the way, let's begin with the very first incident. Let's travel back to the year 2000. On Sunday, July 9th, a bull bison gored a 67-year-old man near Old Faithful. For those who don't know, goring is when the bison's horn punctures a person. The man was from Sydney, Australia. Misspelled on the report, but that's not a big deal. What's most interesting about this incident to me is that the bison was running along the sidewalk while a man with a tour group was standing just between the Old Faithful Inn and the visitor center. What's not known is why the bison started running. In many cases, the bison is provoked by a person, but there was no report of that here. It seems most likely to me that the bison did just start running along on its own, and because of the unexpected nature of that, the man was unable to get out of the way before the goring occurred. The other key reason I have to believe that this was not an intentional provoking of the bison is that typically, the parks issue a reminder afterwards that you need to keep your distance. Instead, the park issued a reminder of how fast bison can run. Therefore, while I can't confirm it, especially because no one had smartphones filming things in the 2000s, it's most likely that this was an unprovoked incident where the bison just started running on its own and unfortunately did gore a person. Now we move to 2001, and on Wednesday, July 11th, a 19-year-old woman was butted by a bull bison. However, this one was very much provoked. She was with a group of multiple friends, and they all got very close to the bison and surrounded it on three sides. As the bison slowly got toward her, she tried to run away, but at that point she got knocked to the ground by the bison. And in this case, the park did issue a reminder that it is illegal to approach within 100 yards of bears and 25 yards of bison and all other wildlife. The key difference between these first two incidents is that in 2000, we learned that wildlife can be unpredictable. In 2001, we learned that approaching wildlife has more predictable outcomes. Now we move to 2002. Just one incident per year so far, and that continues here. The sole incident was a bull bison goring a 37-year-old man on July 13th. This was once again a group of people getting too close to a bison, resulting in the man being picked up by the horns, and then getting thrown into the air. There were criminal charges pending against the man for getting too close and harassing wildlife. I don't know the end result of those, but what is known is that no action was taken against the bison. And this is actually a very important thing, because sometimes animals in national parks can be removed and put down if they are deemed too aggressive and dangerous. In this case, it was evidently clear that the bison was provoked, and most likely for that reason, the bison was not put down. And this is good, once again teaching that while the wildlife can theoretically be aggressive, in many cases, the wildlife is provoked before these incidents occur. Now let's move to 2003, and we do have two incidents here. But they were both covered in one report, because both of them occurred in May, And interestingly, both affected concession employees in the Old Faithful area. The second one was listed first, maybe due to being more recent, and the incident occurred at 9 p.m. on Friday, May 23rd. An employee was outside of Columbine dorm when she was bumped by a bison and injured. Not gored, but she was injured. And this was not one where a person got too close. It seems maybe because it was dark out, the bison simply was not seen coming, and that led to this unfortunate incident. Similarly, at 4:30 a.m. on May 13th, an employee was out in the dark without a flashlight nearby the Old Faithful Inn dining room. The man felt the ground shaking and then was pushed to the ground. Once again, not gored. And he had returned to work after the 2-week period between the incident and the report. So this is good, as it was not a super severe injury, but because it was dark out, there isn't a whole lot of information known about what the bison did, but it is certain that this was not a person getting too close intentionally. The only lesson we can really take from these two stories is being careful when you're out in the dark. We now move to 2004, the year I was born, and the first year with a non-injury incident. But that honestly might make it worse. Because on July 4th evening, 2 men were intentionally harassing a bison. They were caught on video doing things such as waving their arms at it, and even cornering the bison among the trees, somewhat similar to the 2001 incidents. But in this one, it was much more intentional, not with the goal of getting photos, but with the goal of just harassing the bison. The men were intoxicated, and that definitely carried over to their behavior once they were arrested, spitting on the cage and making threats as they were driven to jail. The men were placed on 2 years probation in the park, and ultimately, the lesson here is to not be intoxicated when you're at a national park and to not harass bison. This one, it's not an intent I think a lot of people have in comparison to wanting to get a photo with a bison, but it's definitely a much worse thing to do. So please, don't do it. The second incident of 2004 occurred on the night of October 6th. It unfortunately involves an employee once again, and once again he was near Old Faithful, headed back to his dorm there, and it was late at night. 11:20 p.m. in fact, and he was surprised from behind by a bison, similar to the people from the 2003 incidents. The bison unfortunately gored this man though, and he was even lifted into the air and landed face down. It was a pretty major injury, and definitely one of the more sad stories on this list. Now we have a pretty big jump in time. There were no incidents for 3 years, but in 2008, there was a 12-year-old boy, the Friday before Monday, June 30th, who was flipped into the air by a bison. This is unfortunate, as you never want to see children get injured. But the boy was very close to the bull bison, supposedly within a foot or two, according to witnesses. And even though visitors did warn them to get away, they remained close enough for a long enough period that the bison did injure the boy. There were no gorings, fortunately, but this is just a lesson that, especially when you're being warned about the dangers, you need to take that into account when you're getting close to a bison. It's understandable to want photos, but no photo is worth the potential injury. We now move to 2009, and in this case, there was an incident on June 24th in which a 50-year-old woman from Spain was butted and then tossed into the air by a bull bison. But this one is a weird incident. The woman was too close to the bison, but not intentionally so. She was using a payphone at the Canyon Lodge, and she was not looking behind her. Her back was to the road, and when the bull bison crossed the road, he got within 20 feet of the couple. And it was at that point when the bison came from behind and enacted the injury on the woman. So while these people were too close, they didn't intentionally move too close. And there was an issue reminder from the park about not getting too close to the animals afterwards. So the main lesson here is being aware of your surroundings. Because even if you're not trying to be too close to the animals, sometimes they can come out of nowhere. And in this case, the animal was on the open road, so they would have likely been able to see it. Whether they would have left the payphone, it's hard to know, but ultimately, the main lesson here is knowing that sometimes the animals can get close to you. There was a second incident in 2009, this one on July 22nd. And there was a visitor from Southern California gored by a bison in this case. He was taking pictures of a bull bison, and unfortunately, this one involves the person getting too close. Within around 10 feet of the bison, in fact, and at that point, the bison charged. This incident is much more cut and dry. The guy clearly was getting too close to the bison, and we know what the lesson is there. We now move to 2010, and this incident is simply bizarre, because I've seen two different tellings of it from what I was looking up. According to the report, a woman was walking out of the Biscuit Basin thermal area. She was with two other men, and the bison just kind of appeared out of the brush and then charged them. It's sort of similar to what I believe the very first incident I talked about was, just based on that. But on a CBS News report, it says that one of the men who was with the woman got too close to the bison, and that led to the quote-unquote attack. I don't like to call these attacks, because in many cases it was provoked. It's defense at most. But unfortunately, it's hard to know for sure. But fortunately, on that note, there was a video. This is the first incident where I found video. And based on it, the people were definitely within the distance that you're not supposed to be. And while I'm not sure if they did specific things to provoke apart from that, it seems likely that they were walking, they saw the bison, based on the fact that the woman had been filming for a long enough time. She likely had seen the bison for a while, and they knew that they were filming it, they knew it was there. So I think the idea of this being a sneak attack from the bison is highly unlikely. It's hard to know for sure, but due to the news report and the video itself, they were too close by definition, so while it may not have been the most intentional one, I think it's one where they could have avoided it more easily than the payphone incidents. Let's move to 2012. In this one, a man from Bangkok was thrown into the air by a bull bison. There was very little information on this one, due to it being one of 3 incidents in one day. And it was definitely not the most major incident of that day, so it is kind of hard to know what happened here. But on another news report from the Cody Enterprise, it was confirmed by investigators that this man did get too close to the bison. Not much else to say on that. We now understand the case. And we now move to 2015. There were no incidents for 2 years, but 2015 had quite a few. The first was on Friday, May 16th, in which an exchange student from Taiwan was with their host family and joined a group that was too close to the bison. They were within 10 feet of it, and unfortunately, the 16-year-old girl was lifted and gored. This was brutal, and the fact that there was a big group close in the first place was very likely a part of why the girl got close, and eventually led to that injury. The group never should have been that close. And the next incident is a very similar story. It occurred on June 2nd, and once again, there were several people nearby a bison that was lying down, and a 62-year-old man got within 5, maybe even 3 feet of the bison, when the bison was charging, and then tossed the man into the air several times. Once again, people got too close, and one member of the group was severely injured. Next up is 2 incidents covered in one July 6th report. The first one involved a concession employee that was out in the dark, and the second was a hiking encounter. So for the first one, there was a 19-year-old girl who was coming back from Firehole River late at night. And unfortunately, she, along with some companions, got too close to a bison, not realizing until they were about 10 feet away. It was lying down, and before this girl could get out of the way, the bison charged her and threw her in the air. This is another story where an employee was out in the dark, and unfortunately happened to encounter a bison, So while it was not an intentional one, it is one where we know what the lesson is, but it does unfortunately kind of tie into the unpredictability of the animals. More so, the second incident though, in which a hiker encountered a bison nearby Storm Point Trail. And she attempted to pass the bison, but at that point, she was gored. This is an unfortunate one because coming across wildlife on trails is not an uncommon thing. Animals can be on the trails too. But unfortunately, that sometimes makes you feel like you either have to stay a while and just wait for the animal to leave, or take your chances and pass it. Always, the better is the former. You should wait. It is not worth trying to get past an animal, especially one as large and dangerous as a bison can be. It is always ideal to wait it out. I've had a few instances like this before. I've been on trails where I've seen deer or elk, and while deer particularly are not as known for major injuries, I had to wait quite a while for them to pass just to be safe. Maybe I didn't, maybe I don't know anything about deer, but I do generally think it is ideal to give the wildlife their space, even if you're trying to carry on along a trail. Now for the final incident of 2015, this was a very long report, but it's interesting because it's not a super new one. There was a woman who got too close to a bison trying to get a photo with it. She was with her daughter, unfortunately, and they got within around 6 yards of a bison. They turned their backs to it, and they were warned that they were too close, but at that point, once their backs were turned, the bison came after the woman and threw her into the air. In this particular case, the main thing that we hadn't really heard in a lot of other stories is that the family specifically did know that they were supposed to stay away from the bison. You're not supposed to go within 25 yards. But because they saw other people pretty close, they thought it was okay. And this is an important lesson. You should not follow the group when they are not following the rules. In a case like this, the rule of staying 25 yards away from the bison is set in stone and should always be followed under all circumstances possible. There are certain ones where you aren't able to get out of the way in time, as we'll talk about later, and as we sort of discussed with the Firehole River incident. However, when you can stay out of the way, you always should. And that covers 2015. We're now moving toward some of the most interesting incidents. But before that, we have a 2017 one that's fairly standard. So a man and a woman were on Mud Volcano Trail, and they were taking photos when a bison approached them. So it was not an intentional one, and one single person was butted, but they unfortunately fell onto the other person, so both were injured. Ultimately, this one is not one where they got too close, but it is one that does show that anything can happen on a trail, and it is important to be alert and aware of your surroundings. Whether or not they could have gotten out of the way, I don't know, but it seems like the bison approached them, and it was a very unpredictable situation, but maybe one we can learn a little from. Now for 2018. 2018 might be the craziest year. It didn't have the most incidents, but it had the worst. And you will see that soon. First, we have the second incident in a row in which a 72-year-old woman was injured. And on this one, the woman was going around a bend on a trail. And once she rounded the bend, the bison was there, and she wasn't able to get out of the way before getting butted off the trail. So 2 incidents in a row where people were on a trail, a bison approached them to some degree, and they were butted. So it is a scary one. Once again, trying to be aware of what might be around the bend is the only thing you can do, but that is always a potential fear when you're on a trail rounding a corner. The next incident, this one is an intentional one. In the first week of June, there were quite a few incidents involving animals, and one of them was a person getting too close to a bison. It was on the Wednesday before the incident report came out, and the bison charged once the person got too close. They were gored, supposedly within 15 feet of the bison, and that's about all I have to say on that. We now move to the incidents. It might be the most famous one. I think it's very likely some of you watching had seen this one before. It was not an injury, but it was the most bizarre case of bison harassment, and the full story was something I'd never heard before, but it is bizarre. There was a man who was harassing a bison, caught on video. You've likely seen the video before. He's out on the road wearing no shoes, waving his arms at the bull bison, running around in a circle, trying to avoid getting hit by it. And he did. He was not injured. But there is more to this. The man scored a trifecta, according to the Billings Gazette, involving getting cited in 3 national parks during the same week. That means citations, not being seen, but he was seen in all of them because that's how he got the citations. The very first thing occurred in Grand Teton National Park on July 28th. He was drunk and disorderly, and that's about all that we had to that first incident. Then just 3 days later, he was in Yellowstone, and he was pulled over as a passenger in the car, and he specifically was cited for not wearing a seatbelt. If only that was the worst thing that happened that day, because after this is when the bison incident occurs, where he gets out of the car after all the cars are stopped, approaches the bison, yells at it, waves his arms, and then the bison charged at him. He avoided injury, and this wildlife harassment was reported. Rangers issued a citation for a court appearance after that, and it seemed that rangers knew that he was going to go to Glacier National Park afterwards because he told them. So rangers were on the lookout for him, and the craziest thing is that the same time they were trying to find him, rangers responded to a disturbance at the Many Glacier Hotel, in which there was a major argument, and one of the 2 men that was in this incident was the bison harasser, who was referred to as RR throughout the incident report, as they always just use initials for anonymity. That said, the man's name is definitely known, and you're free to look it up if you look up the 2018 bison harassment thing, or pretty much any keyword that I've said throughout this. And at that point, he was arrested, got 130 days total in jail for the 3 different crimes, and that is the craziest incident I'll be covering all day. But the next one is maybe even more significant to me. In 2019 now, specifically on Monday, July 22nd, a 9-year-old girl from my home state of Florida was injured by a bison when 50 people got too close to the bison charged, and in the video of it, you can see every other adult, presumably including the girl's parents, ditch the kid. They got out of there fast. The girl did not, and she got thrown pretty high in the air, as you can see in the frame from the video that is on the slide. This one is most interesting to me because I actually had a friend in middle school who presumably saw this in person. They were not filming it, but it was definitely one where after I heard the news and then they told me they were there, I was like, oh wow, no way. So this is probably the bison incident that I think of first when I think about all of them at Yellowstone, even with the crazy 2018 harassment one. But ultimately, the lesson here is to not crowd the bison, not get too close, and not to put your children in danger. We now move to 2020. This year had 5 total incidents, but definitely not all injury. The first was, though. A woman got too close on May 27th and received an incident after being charged. This one had very little reporting. She declined to be taken to a hospital, so presumably it was not a super serious injury, but otherwise, not a whole lot is known. So let's move to another one with a 72-year-old woman from California who was gored multiple times by a wild bison. Multiple times might sound like it shouldn't happen, but she did repeatedly approach the bison to take the photograph. And there is video footage of her getting too close. There's not much else known about the aftermath in terms of the person's injuries, but seeing the video, it seemed like as she tried to approach the bison, she was trying to be stealthy. It did not work out, but ultimately, this one is just a moral that You should not get too close to a bison, especially not multiple times. The next one is bizarre. It is a non-injury incident, but it involved two people getting too close, and as they tried to run away from the bison, the woman that was in this group fell over, and she was told to play dead by others. She did, and the bison did not attack. The bison sort of sniffed around for a couple seconds, it seemed, and then left. The weirdest part to me is that you see in the video, the husband was trying to get back to the woman as the bison was near her, and I'm not really sure what the best thing to do in that situation is. Presumably at a certain point, once the bison is right with the person, you shouldn't try to approach it again, because that would only result in further injury. But ideally, this is not something that happens again. Ultimately, you never want to step into terrain where you might end up falling when trying to escape, because you never want to get so close in terrain that you have to be in a position where you would have to escape. I guess playing dead might be a good maneuver for bison. It's not something I've ever been taught. You hear it when talking about grizzly bears a lot more often, but maybe it works for bison too. Maybe it was a one-time thing, but either way, this was an incident where people simply got too close and should not have. Moving later into the season, there were two men harassing bison by riding motorcycles near them on September 11th. The men were driving around, clearly instigating things with the bison. The bison eventually did charge and chase the guys back onto the road, but there is video showing the motorcyclists, and in fact, the two clips that I'm showing here from the video are actually from two separate videos. These men were going around to multiple bison, clearly making a scene. They actually did plead not guilty in court, and that was not very smart considering the video very much proved that they were guilty of bison harassment. The final 2020 incident is another visitor causing a stampede. There was one person who saw many people nearby the river, thinking maybe there was a wolf. As it turned out, there were several tourists getting too close to a bison, and they eventually caused a stampede. The woman was filming and captured video, but I could not find this video anywhere. The article that was being cited doesn't exist anymore. So this incident is fuzzy, but as it was officially reported in the NPS incident report, it seems to me very likely that it was just another case of people getting too close to bison. Nobody was hurt, and that's all there is to this one. Now for 2021. Just one incident, very little information. The second time a Storm Point trail hiker was injured, she was gored by a bison, and that's basically all there is to it. No details had been released as of the report, and very few had been done since. So we'll move on. For 2022, there were two incidents, with the first occurring on May 30th. A 25-year-old got too close to a bison, within 10 feet in fact, and was gored. Some media agencies had apparently reported that the visitor was killed by the bison, but this was not the case. There's two more in 2022 covered by the same report. On June 27th, a 34-year-old man seen on the left side of this photo was gored by a charging bison. Initially, there was a group of 4 people, one family, and the bison ran toward them. The bison stopped short of them, and the people remained close to it for some period of time. To me, based on the video, it definitely seemed like they had time and an opportunity to try to get away from the bison, but they did choose to remain near it and didn't walk away. They seemed slightly on edge, but in the end, the bison charged at the people, specifically to the child, but the 34-year-old man in question grabbed the child and sustained injuries. The man was gored and thrown into the air, but the child was safe. Ultimately, this one does seem like while it was not initially intentional, they had an opportunity to try to get away, and they did not take it. Maybe that would not have worked out, but they did remain close to the bison, and that was not the ideal move in that case. On June 29th, though, there were 2 people who accidentally got too close to a bison while returning to their vehicle. This is definitely one where it was unpredictable, the bison sort of came out of nowhere or was in a place they didn't see, and at that point, the bison did charge them. So that was another lesson on just being careful of the unpredictability of these animals. Now for one incident in 2023. This one has a picture, but it doesn't seem to tell a whole lot, and this was a very ambiguous issue. A 47-year-old was walking on July 16th, and it's unclear how close they were to the bison. But ultimately, the visitor did try to get away from the bison, and at that point, they were charged and gored. It seems like it was probably unintentional, but ultimately, this is one of the most unknown ones, despite being one of the most recent. And now we move to last year. The last year on this particular video. Very early on in the season, April 21st, 2024, a 40-year-old man was observed harassing a bison, even kicking one in the leg. The man was arrested and pled not guilty. That's really all there is to this one. It's another case of harassment. The man was intoxicated. Absolutely should not have been doing that. Definitely one of the worst on here because, while many got close to bison, this was the only person to intentionally touch one. But ultimately, people do try to pet bison, and it is very horrible that it happens. The man sustained minor injuries, but ultimately, this was not an injury case. This was a harassment one. And I feel like when breaking down how brutal injuries were, I feel like this is more of a without injury one, considering they were released from care very quickly, and it was not a case where a person was charged and butted or gored. I feel like the harassment and injury cases are two very separate categories. And the final incident occurred on June 1st, 2024. An 83-year-old man got too close to a bison, once again near Storm Point Trail at Yellowstone Lake. The bison did gore the man and lifted him a bit off the ground. The injuries were serious, and this is, as of right now, the last bison incidents of the 21st century. So let's do some statistical breakdowns, talk about what happened here. There were 34 total incidents, 28 of which involved major injuries. 6 of them were not involving injuries, and that leads to this pie chart here. Another interesting breakdown is how intentional the cases were. I have broken this pie chart down into the intentional cases in which people got too close to bison, knowingly so. Whether or not they knew it was against the rules, they got too close. There was unintentional, in which people didn't mean to get too close, in the sense that they rounded a corner and it happened to be there, or something like that. And then there are the unknown cases where it really could go either way. And based on that, nearly 2/3 of all cases were people getting too close when they didn't have to. And there is something somewhat uplifting about that. Because if you are afraid of going to Yellowstone because of the possibility of getting hurt by a bison, the key thing to know is that most of them are avoidable. Most incidents are caused by people getting too close. Let's break this down a little further. You may have noticed 2015 was the year in which incidents sort of boosted. That's not a key statistical thing necessarily, because before that it just happened to be there were only 2 incidents. But generally, the last 10 years had more incidents than the last 15. And when we break it down solely by injuries, you see a similar thing. There were more harassment cases later on by a small bit, more non-injury ones at the very least in general, but there were still more incidents, which leads to it seeming like there were more injury incidents. But why is this the case? Well, let's start by talking about the actual visitation of the park. 2015, being the first year with 5 incidents, was also the first year in which park attendance hit 4 million. So there were more people in the park, and that sheer quantity might contribute. When we look at this side by side, you can see that the years with over 4 million visitors, it seems like more action happened in general, but then again, 2020 had so many incidents and there was less than 4 million. So I think breaking it down solely by whether there were 4 million people doesn't really work. What might work is doing this math here. I took the average annual visitation from 2000 to 2014, same for 2015 to 2024, and then used the average number of bison incidents, and found out how many bison incidents there were per million visitors. And there was a jump, going from 3.8 to 5.3, a 1.5 incident gap from the first 15 years of the century to the last 10. So it seems like there are more incidents in general. But let's look at some specific kinds of incidents and see what stats we can get from there. So in terms of bison harassment, which is the intentional provocation or harming of bison, there were 5 instances this century so far. 4 of them occurred in 2018 or later. So one of the worst things about these bison incidents in general is that the harassment ones are more common. People being drunk and disorderly, people intentionally causing problems, people just being rude and inconsiderate when it comes to wildlife. I'm trying to use some light words there. I could say worse things about how I feel about the bison harassment, but ultimately, this is one of the worst things that is on the rise in the way, and ideally it never happens again. Now, in terms of accidental encounters, how common are those? Well, these are the ones where people just happen to be too close by chance, and there were at least 8 incidents. However, all of the unknown ones do likely seem like they were unintentional, so there were possibly 12 of those. Based on the confirmed 8 accidental encounters, 5 of them were before 2015, and 4 of them occurred in the dark. So based on that, this is not something that's on the rise in the same way the harassment ones seem to be. Additionally, since half of them did occur in the dark, we can learn something from that, such as just being careful in the dark, which I'll talk about a little more in the conclusion of this video. Before getting to that, I want to list a few additional statistics that I found interesting. The first is that 3 of the 34 incidents involve 72-year-old women. That's not important, and it's not suggesting there's a correlation between that age specifically, but I just found it interesting that that specific age popped up 3 times. Another fact is that 12 of the incidents occurred at the Old Faithful area, and 7 occurred at Yellowstone Lake. This makes sense. Those are 2 of the most common areas to visit in the park, and because there are many workers there, and notable trails that have bison on them, several incidents occurred as that result. This does not mean Old Faithful is super dangerous. It simply relates to the fact that more people are there, incidents are more likely to occur there in general, but as long as you're aware of your surroundings in Old Faithful, that is the best you can do. In terms of a state breakdown, there wasn't a state with an overwhelming amount of people. 3 victims were from California, and 3 people were from Utah, though that does include a Utah man that was one of the motorcyclist harassers. One thing I guess that's kind of interesting is that there were no people from Wyoming, so perhaps those who live closer to the park generally know their stuff more. I mean, the woman who played dead was from Montana, so maybe that is just a classic bison trick. Let me know in the comments. The final thing I wanted to note is that 3 of the injured people were children. And this is unfortunate, and ideally the number never goes up throughout this century. So what can we do? Well, most of the advice is fairly straightforward. The first key thing is what the park always tells you, and what everyone should know before getting to Yellowstone. Stay at least 75 feet, or 22.86 meters, away from bison and all wildlife at all times. This is the most important one. The park tells you to do it. It's a law that you have to stay away. Always do it. It might be tempting to get close for the sake of a photo, but I promise the photo looks great if you're 75 feet away. And no photo is worth goring or any other possible injury. Another key tip is one that's more about just being careful, because you can't always stay 75 feet away from wildlife. Sometimes the wildlife sneaks up. So if you're out in the dark, remember to always have a light with you and be aware of your surroundings. This is not limited to being out in the dark. Being aware of surroundings is important, especially in a place that has so many wild animals like Yellowstone. Another important one is involving bison harassment. I hope everybody watching this video knows not to intentionally harass bison. If you didn't know that beforehand, you know now. And if you ever see someone who is harassing bison, tell them to stop first. And this one, while maybe not for everyone, is my advice. Call the number that is on the screen. This is the criminal tip line for Yellowstone National Park, and while that might seem extreme, bison harassment is a crime. Getting too close to bison or doing anything that harms them is against the law. So I believe it is important to call that number so rangers are aware of the issue and can even put a stop to it. And the final tip, in general, is to make sure everyone in your party knows these tips if you go to Yellowstone. I didn't know these tips until I got to the park, and I was just 9 years old when I first went to Yellowstone. So it is important that everybody knows, because it is possible that someone in the group might run off and try to get close to a bison if they're not aware of the rules. At this point, the rules of staying a certain distance from bison and being aware of your surroundings are things the park repeatedly reminds us of, and they are very well known. And it's likely that many of you already knew these tips when you clicked on the video and just wanted to learn about the other incidents. However, if you didn't, please keep these tips in mind. They are very important. Yellowstone National Park is one of the greatest places you can visit, but there is always a danger of visiting a place full of wild animals. So if you're planning to go to Yellowstone and you either want to get close to bison or you're scared of bison getting too close to you, just remember, you can avoid injury by not intentionally provoking bison, being aware of your surroundings can make a difference, and of course, to avoid citation, wear your seatbelt. I'll see you next time.